This is Abigail Favale, and you're listening to George Fox Talks Culture. All right. Well, I'm here in the studio today with Professor Pickell. I like to say it that way because it sounds like you could be a character in Clue a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah. There is actually a Professor Pickell. You have kids in Wayside.
Oh, really?
The Wayside Stories.
Yes.
He's kind of a wacky character who hypnotizes people. And his name is actually Pickell, but everyone calls him
Professor
Dr. Pickell.
Yeah.
Which happens.
Yeah. I was going to say, we're teaching together next semester, which will be fun in honors. And already some of the honor students were like, it's Professor Pickell. I was like, no, it's Pickell. And they're like, I'm like, okay, fine. So at some point, right, I'm sure that you've dealt with this your entire life.
Before.
Yeah.
It'll happen again.
Okay. Well, I'm excited to have you in the studio. You are a theologian, an ethicist, and one of your areas of expertise is death. So we're going to talk about death today. And I hope it will be edifying and fun and also serious. I'm not actually sure what's going to happen, but I guess
You never know what's going to happen when you talk about death. It's always fun. My dissertation advisor, about halfway through as I was writing, started introducing me as the death guy every time we were in an academic setting. And that always, it set things up for an interesting conversation one way or another.
The death guy, Dr. Death. Oh, yeah, no, exactly. Not that, right? No. Isn't that what they call Jack Kevorkian?
Yeah, Dr. Kevorkian.
Okay, well, maybe we'll talk about Dr. Kevorkian, right? So I guess one way to jump in, I think I would like to hear kind of your, sense of American culture right now in terms of our attitude toward death. Like, how would you describe it? How is death thought of and dealt with in America?
When it's thought of and dealt with, which is actually kind of a big, thing, as people think about culture and how it relates to death and dying. I mean, one of the sort of things that's been remarked upon by a million people is that generally in the West and in America, we don't like to think or talk about death in the first place. We tend to put it out of mind as much as possible, which means that sort of for many of us, when we reach the end of life, if we're sort of dealing with the decisions that ultimately come or thinking about how we're going to care for our family members, the first discussion that happens is kind of at a crucial point of decision, which is not always a good time to have the conversation. But, just broadly in our culture, I think there's this interesting phenomenon. For a long time, it was said in our culture that death was taboo, that it was something you didn't really talk about. And this all really began to change with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and what came to be known as the death awareness movement. She wrote this book, sort of foundational book on grief. And this was in sort of the 1960s, 1970s. Things began to come out in the open a little bit. And now, there are bestsellers about death and dying. Atul Gawande's Being Mortal, Paul Kalanithe's When Breath Becomes Air. You get movies dealing with end-of-life issues more and more. So there's a sense in which the sort of taboo nature is maybe lessening. And yet I was thinking about this recently. There was a famous sociologist named Jeffrey Gorer who wrote an article in the 1950s called The Pornography of Death, in which he was sort of making the argument that the way Victorian societies dealt with sex as a taboo was being mirrored in the way 1950s American culture was dealing with death as a taboo. And the way you know that something is taboo is that when it comes out into the open, it comes out in a sort of sensationalized way, a way that's separated from any sense of normalcy or quotidian, and only is sort of thought about in hypersensualized ways. You could think about that in terms of pornography very easily, but in his time, it was sort of horror books and ultimately films. And I do think that there's still really a sense in which when we encounter death and dying, most often it's in a sensationalized way that is really divorced from any real life emotions and relationships, and we get it in video games and movies and violence and things like that. So I think that there is still a sense in which we have a long way to go becoming comfortable bringing death into the open.
Have you ever watched The Walking Dead?
No, but the zombie and the
that's what I'm
undead
thinking
kind
of.
of phenomenon is another big one.
Yeah. I'm wondering what it means, because I really like The Walking Dead. I like zombie stuff, and I don't know why.
Yeah.
I'm kind of wondering what's going on there.
You got that, because it doesn't come out in any other way. So,
yeah,
we feel compelled toward it in other ways.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. That's fascinating. So a lot of your research has had to do with end of life care, I guess. So focusing on that part of our culture specifically, what's the terrain these days in terms of, I guess, in the medical world, or the kind of medicalization of death, or an end of life?
Yeah, medicalization of death is obviously a really big thing. I think most of us, when we think about bad ways to die, we think about the ICU. We think about being sort of in an antiseptic, clinical, mechanical kind of situation in which we sort of have lost maybe functions, but we're tied up to machines, things like that. And I do think that happens and continues to happen. But there's a broader awareness within the medical sphere that that's not the way most people want to end their lives, and not the context. And so I think there are more and more sort of off-ramps to take a step away from what we might call over-treatment. Daniel Callahan calls it the brinkmanship of dying. So this sort of traditionally, when it comes to treating people at the end of life, there's a sense that you want to do everything you possibly can, but you don't want to do too much. But nobody really knows where the line is. So you do this kind of risky behavior of trying to push the edge as much as possible. This typically as sort of a physician or caretaker, and sort of leaving it in the patient's hands when to say no. But then, of course, none of us knows when to say no. And when the doctor says we could do this, you say, well, okay, So it's really hard to sort of step away from that inertia and momentum that leads towards overtreatment still. But hospice and palliative care are huge areas of medicine that are continuing to grow. And I think one of the issues is trying to find ways to make sure that they're sort of properly remunerated, and that there's, ways for that kind of medicine to be incentivized in our insurance schemes and, health, public policy, things like that. But yeah, I mean, when I talk to my students, the other sort of thing with the terrain, this is new to me, having just moved to Oregon, where death with dying and death with dignity, and aid in dying has been a legal practice for a very long time now, and is very much the way my students, for the most part, sort of assume things are and should be. And coming from a place in the country where that's not the case, and it's not sort of legal, has been a really interesting sort of teaching opportunity for me. And to talk with my students about this in our ethics class has been really fun and eye-opening to me. But end of life processes of assisted suicide and aid in dying and euthanasia, and those questions are very much on the table, I think, for a lot of people, because nobody wants to do the overtreatment thing. Nobody wants to medicalize death. And there's this assumption that, this is the only surefire way to avoid it. Of course, I don't think that that's true.
Right. But, well, I'm interested in the difference you describe in, say, teaching students, because I assume you're talking about Fox students, right?
Yeah, of course.
Many of whom would be maybe Christian, at least in some sense, but you're saying that they're very friendly with this idea of death with dignity. And what do you think it is? Like, how are they thinking about death in a way that's different from how you have been thinking about it or would think about it? Like, what is, you know what I mean? Like, what assumptions are they making, or how is it being framed in their mind where they think, this is fine, this is good?
Yeah, I think, one of the assumptions that is invoked a lot has to do with sort of nobody should be able to tell you how your life should end, what kind of medical care you should receive. There is this sort of libertarian streak that's very present. And, I very much am in favor of autonomy in the medical sphere. And I think that, bygone years, the paternalism of medicine was way over rampant. And it was actually the case that if you had cancer or you had a terminal diagnosis in the 1950s, you had about a 50% chance that your physician would even tell you. And
Whoa.
many times they wouldn't tell the patient that they had cancer. They might tell the family, that sort of thing. So this is, things that we take completely for granted were not always the case. And I think that that's a good thing. And yet one of the assumptions around that is that really anything a patient wants to have in a medical sphere should happen. There's the assumption that patients are consumers and that doctors are providers, and then that's the sort of relationship that obtains between them. And so when a physician would say, no, that's not appropriate, it would be an imposition of one's morals on somebody else. And that's a big part of the discussion. The other big assumption that I'm noticing has to do with just the assumption that when you're at the end of your life, it's going to be terrible. That if you are old and you have a terminal diagnosis, that you are almost certainly going to have pain that is unbearable and unrelenting, and that you're going to lose all of your capacities for self-determination and independence, and that that's a bad thing. And so there are all sorts of assumptions going into this that really, as the leading organization that's pro-assisted dying, compassion and choices, it really comes down to those two things. It should be your choice, and it is the most compassionate thing. I think we have to question some of those assumptions sometimes. There are instances where those things are true, but by and large, palliative medicine is very able to deal with pain. By and large, it's not fun to become dependent, but there may be some good things involved in that process. It is not undignified to be cared for, in a sense, which is something that I think we in America really struggle with. So this idea of being self-made and independent as the source of our worth and our value and dignity. Those are some of the things I'm noticing. It makes for really good discussions in the classroom.
Well, I'm really interested in that last point that you just brought up, that maybe in America there's a particular sense in which our value or worth or dignity is defined by being independent and self-determining and active. And that seems to me like a very different understanding than, like the Christian vision. And so I guess when you bring particularly a Christian lens into this and a Christian understanding, how would you push back against some of those assumptions? Like especially the one you mentioned that it's bad to become dependent, or it's bad to rely on others, or it's undignified, right? Like how would you, I guess, reframe that from a Christian understanding? Yeah.
I mean, one of the things, so there's a Christian ethicist, contemporary thinker, Stanley Hauerwas, who talks a lot about how our ethos is kind of driven by a couple of things. One is we want to get out of life alive. That's one of his terms. And then the other term is, the other thing he talks about is that the Christian life is, in a sense, about learning how to live out of control. And so there's this idea that, and this all came to the fore for me when I started writing about this, because I became interested in death, not directly, but through an experience of illness. And I was diagnosed with cancer early on in my doctoral studies, and began to, I'm fine now, but, had to go through treatment while I was thinking about issues of life and death and sickness.
So had you already chosen that focus before your diagnosis?
No, not at all. No.
So it came out.
I was going to go do something else completely. And then I was teaching bioethics as a teaching assistant. So I would talk to students at 1 p.m., 2 p.m., and 3 p.m. on Friday afternoon. And then I'd walk down to the cancer center and get my chemotherapy infusion, and then go home and zonk out with chemo brain for the weekend, and then start it all over. And one of the things I started wrestling with was this idea of control, and the way in which our sort of the limitations of our bodies, when we bump up against them, challenge our notions that we've always been in control and we will always be in control. And for me and my wife, we didn't have any kids yet, but we were thinking like, oh, maybe we want to have kids, but we had a 5-year plan in place.
Right.
We would be married for 5 years and then we would have our kids. And then like year 4, this happened. And it's like, oh, we may never be able to have kids. Maybe we weren't in control the same way we thought. And so what does that mean for our faith life? What does that mean for how we think about where God is in all this and, how we rely on him? And so it became intensely personal, but through this idea of control and what does it mean that we can control certain things, but we can't ultimately control everything.
Right.
And that's the place where faith comes in.
Yeah.
That's the place where trust comes in. And ultimately, death signals the limit of our control. It's the ultimate limit. It's the thing that we can never and will never be able to fully control. And so it comes back into our life as sort of a, insofar as we're aware of that, we may also start to notice the other things that we may have to trust God in, and that's okay, and that's actually good for us. And so, this idea of control versus trust, I think, also plays out in our relationships with each other. The assumption that we live our best life when we are fully in control,
right,
is one that comes very natural to many of us, but it leaves out some very key parts of what it means to be human, what it means to ultimately, I think, accept what's outside of our control as a gift.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a big sort of Christian teaching. Creation itself is a gift, right? And it's to be received in that posture. And it's only in receiving it in that posture that we can treat it as what it really is.
Yeah.
And to the degree that we see creation itself simply as resources for us to do whatever we want to do with, we're misusing it. We're not seeing properly. Yeah. So, this idea of control and independence, I think, is one that, for me, I've learned to see the basic spiritual impulse behind Christianity as one of recognizing and appreciating what it means to be dependent, not just in my relationships, but on God, ultimately.
Yeah. I mean, that seems to be so fundamental to a Christian understanding and just a Christian way of living, right? Like that word receive that you talked about, it just seems like that trust and receptivity, and that having more of an ethic of control and self-reliance, that seems like that would be a pretty significant barrier between the soul and God. And so in a strange way, I think suffering and death can be this way of God. God can work in those things to bring us around to that posture of trust in him in a way that maybe can't happen in other ways. Like a few years ago, my grandpa, who I was pretty close to, he died in 2017. And I was pregnant with my 3rd kid at the time, and so I couldn't go see him. And he was kind of declining. It wasn't this illness per se, but there was a period in the summer where he was really thinking about taking his own life. And I think it was this effort to have control over. And he was still living at home. He wasn't in, like debilitating pain. Of course, I'm sure he was in a certain amount of pain, but and there was a point where he was like, had like a loaded gun in his walker just to kind of like have it around as this option. And I just remember at the time, like praying a lot about, I just didn't want him to do that. Right. Because I think there's like this dance between the soul and God. And I think if we choose to cut that off prematurely, then we cut off the opportunity for God to work in our lives. And my grandpa was like, an agnostic / atheist. I mean, my last conversation with him, I told him I was praying for him, and he was like, well, if I believed, I'd be praying for you too, But then, he did not kill himself. He did not take his own life. And he died in December. And he actually had, like, after that kind of time in the summer when he almost killed himself, there was this kind of like rebound period where he felt a lot better, and he had these like last couple of really good months before his final decline in December. And in December, he, like for the last few days of his life, he lost the ability to speak. But before that, the only thing he wanted these old, he was Southern, he wanted these old, like traditional kind of Southern hymns played, like Come As You Are and Oh Thou Fount of Every Blessing. And even though he had lost the ability to speak, he like wanted just to hear that music. And I don't know, when I heard that, I held on to that as this like, I don't know, this sign that there was something in him in that experience of dying that was turning toward God, you know, and whatever happened then, it was this like wordless communion between him and God. But I just think if he had taken matters into his own hands and decided, I want to die, you know, I want to have control of my own death, then that process of dying and that turning to God that I think was happening could not have happened, right? And so sometimes I think about the moment of death and how much God can work in that final moment when we're, like you said, really pushed to the limit, or we're like faced with the myth that we can be our own God, you know?
Yeah. And I mean, what that beautiful story just makes me think about is that you can never know what meaning a moment of life can have, you know? And it's not to say that the answer is to extend life as long as possible, because that kind of has its own issues, and it's not sort of a worship of sort of vitalism in and of itself, but sort of a holding open of the possibility that life can be meaningful even in the midst of decline and suffering. And I think we so often just, you know, flippantly say things like life becomes meaningless in such and such situation, or you know, suffering can't have meaning, or those sorts of things. The other thing your story reminds me of is, by and large, people who obtain, I don't remember the statistics on this, but last time I looked at it, by and large, people who obtain prescriptions for life-ending barbiturates never actually end up taking them.
Really? Interesting.
And part of what's interesting about this is when you survey people who seek out physician-assisted suicide or aid in dying and ask them why, the number one reason is not pain and suffering. And it's not, fear of the unknown, but it's the fear of being out of control. That's the number one thing that's cited. And so there is this sense, it's kind of like a Zen thing where many people who obtain the prescription hold on to it as sort of a, just this sense that, you have this, you always have this option, even though you never really maybe intend to use it or want to per se. And so, your story of your grandfather with his pistol on his walker, I think is very much in that spirit.
Right.
And yet, what does it mean to be able to let go of that, that basic control? And control isn't bad. And this is where it gets really tricky, because obviously we also have responsibility, and we have technologies that allow us to do all sorts of amazing things. And we are thankful for medicine by and large and what it allows us to achieve. And so, this is where it gets, when we talk about it in ethics classes like mine, sometimes people just want the right answer of what's the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do. But oftentimes what it comes down to is sort of, well, what is your posture? And that's not to justify anything based on your posture, but it's to say that's a morally relevant part of the discussion. Is
what do you mean by posture?
Well, what is your, you can exercise control by ending your life or by extending it. But your basic posture in that sense is being in control to be, we might sort of theologize it and to say to be like God, sicut Deus, and, to be the center of your own world, to be independent in a way that we sort of think God is independent, right? And yet you can also sort of end treatment in a manner that's sort of open, or you can pursue treatment in a manner that's open to whatever God might have for you. You can do both in faith.
Right.
And so, I think from a Christian ethics point of view, the sort of the heart matters. It doesn't justify everything, but it's, what is going on there at a deep spiritual level.
Right. Yeah. I see what you're saying. I mean, you could take this idea of, receptivity to an extreme where it's like, oh, like I have cancer, so I'm not going to do anything about it. Right. Because there is a sense in which, we are also endowed with gifts like reason and, that have enabled us to develop technologies and to, and treatments, and that fighting for your life, is also a good thing and a valiant thing. Yeah. I wonder about grieving as well. Like I guess what we should do after death or, after someone who's died. Right. So to use my grandpa as an example again. So he died in December, and then it wasn't really his funeral because he donated his body to science. So I never saw his body. The last time I saw him was almost 2 years before he died. So, and when I went to his memorial service, it was in a hotel ballroom kind of setting. Right. So, and then, there was music and people sharing stories about him. And so there was meaningful in that way. But I think there's a way in which I wasn't able to grieve for him because his body was never present. It felt like this abstract thing, it took longer for me to even accept the reality of his death. And then I would contrast that with my friend, you know Javier as well, who died this summer. And we were able to have the full meal deal with his, which is amazing that there's so many ways you can see God working, in retrospect. So he died in June, and it was this moment of the COVID thing had kind of quieted down enough for us to even be able to have a large gathering. It was just this kind of eye of the storm in a way. But there was a vigil, there was a funeral with the body present, and there was a burial. And I had never experienced that kind of, I don't know. I remember the priest talked about it as almost there's this work that we have to do now, this liturgy, right? We actually have to do this work of grieving and honoring Javier, and being able to do that work and being able to see his body. And it was such a different experience of grieving someone who had died. There was so much more cathartic and concrete and beautiful. I don't know. It's so hard to explain, but it's really changed the way that I think about, now I think about things like that. I think about what do I want to happen after I die? I'm I want a vigil, I want people, if it's possible, to be able to sit with my body for as long as they need to, because that was something that was really meaningful for me. But I don't know. So what are some of your thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I love that you bring this up. I would teach a class in the religious studies department on religious ethics, on death and dying in my previous spot. And one of the things I had students do was to write their own funeral service, to get them thinking about what happens communally when we die. And in a sense, who is the funeral for? Is it for the person who's died, or is it for the people who remain? And it's a big, question for me, thinking about what is the work to be done, and how do our community or lack of communal responses inhibit the work that is to be done. So it's in the literature on death and dying, often people will talk about the way dying changed with the advent of modernity and modern medicine. And one of the big things is it moved into the hospital and it moved out of the home. And it became something that was sort of divorced from the rest of people's relationships. And in particular, children would not be present when somebody died, or to see their body. It's sort of out of sight, out of mind. And so that's one thing that I think most of us have experienced. I've never really seen somebody at their deathbed or anything like that.
Yeah.
In the Middle Ages, there's a historian named Philippe Ari who writes about what he called tamed dying or tamed death. And tamed death for him was death that was met within a context of choreographed and well-known liturgical responses within a community. And what made death tamed in that sense is that when it came, it was familiar, and people knew what to do, right? They knew what to do when death was coming, when it was drawing near. There were handbooks that you could read, these sort of Ars Moriendi, the Art of Dying handbooks that were wildly popular in the Middle Ages and sort of outlined a communal, choreographed kind of back and forth. There was a role for the person who was dying, who would call people in and make amends, and then there would be liturgies to be said, and the priest would have a role, and other people would have a role, and then when somebody had died, people knew how to respond, and really we have nothing like that today, and there's all sorts of reasons why, having to do with sort of illness trajectories and how people die, what people die of, and how sort of our technologies play a role in that. And then the sort of pluralism of our life where we don't have these sort of, we don't have scripts anymore to know what to do. And so what you're describing, that Javier's, funeral and memorial and burial, was a preservation of a sort of script.
Yeah.
That has been brought through and is continued to be observed, that allows people to have sort of a role and to do something together. I think about it, I'm theologian, but religious studies kind of perspective as well. And it's sort of, what are our rituals doing is a big question. And one of the things that I think rituals do is allow us to have answers to life's deepest questions ready to hand without having to think about them. They're sort of inscribed on us through the practices that we do. And one of the answers to death is that it doesn't ultimately rupture community, and it doesn't threaten all meaning. And that's what a funeral does, is it reinstates, like, we're here together.
Right.
And this doesn't ultimately undo the meaning of all that we thought was important.
Right.
And we can hold this together. I'm sort of struck by, it's the last example I'll give, but in the Jewish tradition, traditionally there's a practice of, when somebody dies in grief and mourning, there's, sitting Shiva, which is you just come and you be with somebody and you don't say anything. And you be with them for 7 days is sort of the.
And is that after the person's died?
That's after somebody's died. And it kind of comes from the book of Job. And that's what his friends came and did at the beginning before they opened their fat mouths and started trying to explain
ruined
everything. But, this sort of sense of, we're here with you. But then there's a number of prayers that people who are grieving and in grief are given to say. And the one that's sort of said monthly after somebody has died is really remarkable in that it doesn't say anything about death. It's really just sort of "O Lord God, you're in control, and how great you are, O Lord." And you're sort of restating your basic tenets towards God in the aftermath of grief and mourning. And it's sort of I think it's a great gift to be given words to say that allow you to sort of maintain what's truest throughout really an experience that does threaten to undo everything. That's what death sort of signals, the end of all our control, but also the potential sort of arbitrariness of all of life. So I think one of the biggest problems we have in our own day is we have no scripts and we have no guidance, and it means that all the sort of meaning making gets thrown back on us as individuals.
Yes.
And when you try to make meaning as an individual, it's incredibly fragile.
Yeah.
It's, it doesn't necessarily hold.
Right.
Yeah.
And you can't make meaning when you're the one who's dead. right? When you're the
Right.
one who's dying, right? And so it seems, there needs to be meaning that's beyond that in order for that to be meaningful. And it seems like that's a key difference maybe from, say, a Christian understanding of death, where suffering and death, rather than being meaningless, which it seems like that's maybe more the kind of default, maybe like secular position, I guess, or not even a position, but just kind of a sense, like it's better to end someone's, have someone have the ability to end their life early because suffering meaninglessly, like there's this kind of assumption
To
that
prevent meaningless suffering.
meaningless suffering, right? But I guess in a Christian understanding, suffering can become incredibly meaningful, like almost charged with meaning to a degree, that life, when we're, fat and happy and healthy, in a way that can almost be the meaning. That's when we're probably more at risk for meaninglessness, than when we're suffering and dying, which is a hard sell. It's hard to especially to, 18 and 19-year-olds or whoever, like our students, our dear students, to get them to think like, what, not that suffering can be good, right? Because suffering is always an evil, but it's nonetheless an evil from which good can come. And I really do think that there's a way in which God can work in our suffering more profoundly than he can in other ways. And I think it's because we're in, it like strips away the illusion that we are in control and that we can rely on ourselves and that we can make our own meaning. But the scripts, I think, are increasingly important to me. I'm a Catholic. I became Catholic like 7 or 8 years ago. And one of the things that I love about that tradition is that there's so many scripts, right? There's so many prayers and liturgies. You don't have to make it up. Like, you can turn to it. And that's been really important for me. Like a few years ago, I had a miscarriage, and there was discovering that there's like this liturgy for parents who've lost a child before birth, and being able to like pray that through. Like that felt like just such a gift, right? Because I think our culture doesn't really know what to do with that kind of death, right? Because I think our culture is very invested in not really wanting to look seriously at kind of the human value of unborn people, because there's so much political controversy over abortion. So miscarriage becomes this thing like, well, what do you do? Like, how do you mourn, right? You're not, this, on one level, this being isn't supposed to really truly be a person yet. But I think any woman who's had a miscarriage knows that that's not true. But there's not really a lot of space to mourn and to recognize that death and that person. And so just having that script in that time was so immensely meaningful. And it's funny, even I remember it was not long after I became Catholic, I ran across a part of a prayer that said something like, Lord, what was it? Like, save me from a sudden death. Yeah. And I remember thinking about that, like, whoa, that's such an interesting idea. And I actually like occasionally pray that now, because the way I think about death has really changed, I think, since becoming Catholic, because there is actually there's a sacrament for those final times. And I've thought like, I want to see death coming so I can get ready and like hand my soul over to God in this kind of like conscious way. So then sometimes I think like, well, it's kind of a dangerous, I might be accidentally praying that I like have a long and lingering illness or something, but at the same time, like, I don't know, I think about what does a good death look like, and people might say like, oh, quick and painless. And it's like, no, like to me, I want meaning. Like I want my death to be meaningful, and I want to be able to be prepared for it. But maybe that's me being controlling. I don't know.
Well, no, I mean, and I think the quick and painless answer is the one you'll get 90% of the time from students, or most people, I think, would say they want to die painlessly and in their sleep, probably.
Right.
Or doing something that they love would be the other answer you get.
Well, that's what
like
Javier did die
exactly.
doing something
and,
he loved.
And I think that there's obviously something very beautiful and fitting about that for any individual. I think this idea of, it's interesting, a quick and painless death on the one hand, and a long, drawn-out medicalized death on the other hand, both inhibit exactly what you're talking about, which is being ready for the end. Part of the challenge with the long, drawn-out dying, the medicalized dying, is that you never know when to say someone's dying, right? When are we dying? Right? At what point are you dying if you have a terminal illness that's being treated, and that we have machines that can keep your body warm and going for a long, long time, and it's generally sort of there's different illness trajectories, they call them, and one is sort of the revolving door, which is somebody who has maybe like congenital heart, or not congenital, but like COPD or like heart disease. They'll sort of have these acute, incidences where they end up in the hospital and then they're better, but they're a little bit worse off than before.
Okay.
But they're generally better. And then it'll happen again. And like one of these is going to be the thing that ends your life, but you never know which one. And so it's sort of like, well, when are you dying here? We don't really know. And then another more common trajectory is just a sort of slow, lingering decline, in which it's not any one particular thing, but we live so long now, and you're sort of extreme old age. And at some point the cumulative nature of it all means that your body can't repair itself or keep itself going. But, when do you say goodbye in these moments? When do you prepare? Or, I think that's a real big challenge, and one that, this is where it's really interesting. You sort of get into epidemiology and how it fits into our ways of approaching death, because in the Middle Ages, you would often die of something that would not kill you right away, but also would not be long and drawn out. And so,
like what? Like what's an example?
Well, like you'd get like a big cut that ended up with an infection, and so you had this sense that like, oh, this is probably going to kill me, and like the end is coming. Or you'd just get sick. You'd have sort of an illness that would last 2 or 3 weeks, and
I see. So it's not this like month-long, year-long kind of
exactly, battle, and that's the context in which a lot of these sort of scripts came about and were developed, and it's hard to do those things and to be prepared when you just don't know when to say somebody's actually dying, which is, on the other side, maybe we're all dying all the time.
Like we all have a terminal illness in a way, like we're mortal. So I recently learned that there's kind of a little bit of an ethical debate about the concept of brain death. Are you familiar with this at all?
Yeah, a little bit.
I'm interested. I know nothing, but what's controversial about brain death?
Yeah, well, first of all, there's different kinds of brain death. And in sort of the early days when they were trying to figure out, like, well, what role does brain death play in dying? The big problem was mostly there was a tried and true way to know when somebody had died, and that would be they stopped breathing. So the breath had this sort of significance. And, you'd put a feather over their mouth, and if they're not breathing, then they're dead. And, at some point we became able to keep breath going. Right. And so you have this technological intervention, and yet you're doing so artificially in a sense when the person is not able to sort of on their own keep their breath going.
Right. So it's just like mechanically.
Just mechanical, pure mechanical. And then there's situations in which your inability to breathe sometimes is linked to the sort of your brain stem no longer functioning. Right. It doesn't do that like regular thing, but there's other parts of your brain too that may not function. And so there became early on this question of, well, is it higher brain death that matters, or whole brain death or total brain death that matters? And, the question here is the central most important thing about your thinking? If it is, then in higher brain death, you've lost all sense of self. You've lost all sense of sort of capacity for thinking and operating and doing all the things humans typically do, right? Except that your lower brain might be keeping your body alive.
Oh, interesting.
So ultimately, I think they came down to this sense in which it's whole brain death that matters, and when your whole brain no longer is functioning, then there is, even if we can keep your body sort of going, you don't have, you've sort of achieved death. Your bodily functions are no longer integrated in that sense. Now, the controversial thing still is sort of higher brain death. When somebody maybe is in a permanent vegetative state, or when they, are unable to think in any cognitive fashion. The sort of big question is, are they dead? Are they still there? And that's a really complicated thing. But all of this really comes down to, I think, some deep assumptions and questions we have about what it means to live and what the value of life is. And, with brain death, I think it gets most controversial when technology is introduced and there's still hope for a miracle, or that God can sort of bring back what's missing, because our traditional understanding of death, meaning sort of cardiopulmonary death, has not happened.
I see.
And yet the brain death has. And so the question is sort of, well, maybe we keep this person alive, maybe we wait. And it's an incredibly sort of, heart-wrenching place to be. And yet I think doctors see it all the time. It's sort of very common, maybe overstating it, but not uncommon thing to have happen.
And so does it happen that, on a very rare occasion, someone comes back when there's a state of...
There are cases of people coming back from permanent vegetative states, you might say, from higher brain death, sort of unexpectedly. It's very rare, but it has happened, yeah.
So whole brain death would include the lower brain function. So in that sense, any functioning in the body is purely mechanical.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
But there might be cases where, like in a vegetative state, is that the higher brain's not working, but yet the lower brain is.
That's right.
Yeah. Oh, wow. What's your opinion on brain death?
Well, I mean, I think our technology means that when death basically, I think, signals when our body's no longer able to keep itself going. And so there's a sort of integrative notion of all things working together. And if there's no hope for all things working together ever again, and that is sort of located in the brain, that's sort of where that sort of integration happens, then death has occurred by all, standard measures. And so, I think cases of permanent vegetative states are different. I don't think it's fair to say that death has occurred. And yet I don't always think that it's necessary to continue to extend life in those situations. And so there is a sense when you might say, we've done what we can, and, we can let this person go. We can let sort of the way in which their, body is trending become, we can let it happen. We can let death come. And I think that that's the challenge of our own, we don't like to talk about or think about death, but we also don't know how to welcome it. And so that's a real challenge as well for a lot of people.
It's an interesting idea of welcoming death, right? Like what would that look like? I like that idea. Although there's also something kind of, I don't know, almost like scandalous about it in a way. It's so counterintuitive to what I think, how we most often regard death. I remember once, and in a talk you gave, you used I think this is the phrase you used. You talked about a spirituality of martyrdom. Is that right? Am I remembering this right? Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about what you mean by that? Because I'm intrigued by that idea as like a Christian way of living. Like, what does it look like to live with a particular attitude toward death, right? Yeah.
So, I mean, what does martyr mean? It means witness, right? I mean, that's sort of your witness or your testimony is found in how you live. And yet within the early church, there were certain people who then were also just sort of designated as martyrs. And why were they designated as martyrs? Well, there were people who lived that witness all the way up to the end, right? And did so in a way that their impending death or their way of death, or often persecution from the outside, did not ultimately threaten their faith or their faithfulness. And within this idea of martyrdom, it basically means that insofar as these people are to be celebrated, they're to be celebrated because there are goods that are higher than life, right? And there are evils that are worse than death. There's, to avoid death by giving up the good of faith or faithfulness would be to basically to place something lower above something higher, right? It would be sort of disordered loves or affections or living. And yet one of the things Augustine says is that he has this place, I think in a sermon, where he says, one can be a martyr even on their deathbed. Basically, a sick person can be a martyr. Well, what does that mean? They're not being persecuted. They're not, being asked to defend their faith or die, or, what we might sort of typically think about sort of what martyrdom is. Well, what it means is that their faithfulness is lived all the way up to the end. And their dying doesn't threaten it, doesn't ultimately undo it. And so this idea of spirituality of martyrdom, for me, coming from a few different thinkers, Servais Pinckaers is one who writes about it, but is this notion that faithfulness all the way up to the end is what life is really about. And death and dying provides sort of an avenue to live out faithfulness all the way to the end, with all of its challenges, with the challenges, very real challenges of losing your independence, of going through pain and suffering and all these things. And yet, another theologian, Karl Rahner, talks about how this idea of martyrdom, of faithfulness all the way to the end, what that demonstrates is that the martyr not only is faithful at the end, but that faithfulness is shown to have been what he calls the axiological principle of their life. It's sort of that's how they lived all along. And the end of their life just sort of provided an occasion for them to live it again, to show it. And so, it makes us think about, well, how are we living all along? Are we, then the other sort of last bit, and this goes back to that notion of control that we talked about before, is for a martyr to try to avoid death often would have meant for them to have tried to, in a sense, take control and try to sort of engineer another way for God's will to be done, right? It might mean that they sort of, they deny their faith in a sense, but they know they're going to have a chance to come back and, make things right, or, and so there's a very real sense in which for the martyrs of the early church, there's a sort of giving over the control to say, well, we're not ultimately going to win in any worldly sense here. And yet God must be in control, and we're sort of going to give it up to him. And so that sort of faithfulness to the end, combined with this notion of, well, our point here is not to sort of ultimately bring about God's kingdom or to make everything turn out right, but is to simply be sort of a witness to the goodness of God. That's how I think about sort of martyrdom's relevance to us and how we live. It's sort of, the martyrs become for us a symbol of that, and a witness and exemplar, and inspire us.
And I think in the course we're going to teach together in the spring,
Perpetua.
Oh yes, Perpetua and Felicitas.
I saw that,
and also Eusebius, I think is still in the roster, but he tells some hardcore stories of martyrs, man. Like Polycarp's one of my favorites. But it seemed like during those times of Roman persecution that martyrdom became so much a part of Christian life and identity. I mean, he describes what almost sound like martyr schools for children. I mean, children are kind of taught this idea of martyrdom, and almost to kind of not seek it out in like a, suicide by cop kind of way, but actually preparing themselves to probably die for the faith. And I think it's Eusebius who will sometimes describe about, people who joyfully ran toward their martyrdom, and So I'm also wondering if there's, I don't know, like, is there this really like hardcore Christian understanding of death where, I mean, you can imagine someone making the argument that like, okay, well, when you have a loved one who's died in the faith, you know they're in heaven. Like, you know right now that they're with God. They're happier than they've ever been. They're more alive than they've ever been. So why are you sad? Like, why aren't we just, why don't we have this attitude toward death of almost either radical stoicism or even celebration, right? Like, I mean, guess how would you respond to that? Like, is that an expectation that Christians should have? Like, why not just see death as this like good thing?
Yeah. I think that's the other side of sort of our cultural understanding is sort of maybe a celebration or a running up toward or a glorifying or glorification of death or even suffering. And I think that the early church really did have some questionable, periods with this. And, maybe it's understandable in a period of sort of intense persecution, right, and when you actually don't have a lot of control, and maybe there were other sort of maybe theological streams coming in and out that may have been sort of particularly sort of dualistic or thinking about sort of spiritual over material, and maybe even sort of not really, appreciating the goodness of creation itself. There's Augustine's teacher Ambrose gave I think his brother died, and he gave 2 sermons on death, sort of one week after another. And the first one was sort of a radically stoic, picture of death, and it can't touch us because,
right,
as long as we're here, death isn't, and where we go after we die is with God, and there is no evil in death. And then he came back the next week and was like, I don't think I was right in all that I said. And
wow.
and part of what it comes down to, I think, is just sort of, there's just a very sort of human element here of we grieve. We rightly grieve what we lose, and that death does remain an evil. It's an evil whose sting has been taken away in a sense. And so for a Christian, it can't be the ultimate evil. It can't be the ultimate bad thing. And it ought not to necessarily lead us to fear. And yet, Aquinas would say, that heaven isn't sort of complete right now, in a sense, because there are souls that are with God, but they're not with their body. Yeah. And that when the souls are reunited with their body and then be with God, they'll worship God, not sort of to a fuller extent, not they'll worship God more, but they'll worship him more wholly. Right. And so, I think that there is a lot to continue to grieve in it, and we're very real human creatures. And I think that when our theology begins to feel and look inhuman, I think that's a signal to us that maybe we've got something wrong.
Right. I think Bernard of Clairvaux talks about that, how after death, like the soul is in bliss in heaven, but yet longs to be reunited with its body, and which I think is just a really beautiful idea. But I think sometimes you'll hear this idea that like death is a natural, right? Because and this would be more kind of a secular approach of like, we shouldn't fear death. Like death is part of the natural cycle of things. Like we don't need to pathologize it but there's a sense in which for the Christian, like death is natural, yes, but death is also very unnatural. Like death is not what we are made for. We are not like other mortal creatures, but we have eternal souls that are made for communion with God, right? And to be separated from those with whom we have communion is, I don't know, I mean, unnatural is probably not the word, but like there's something wrong with it, that there's something bad about it. I mean, something evil about it. And that one of the things that Christ came to restore or to conquer is death. It's not just sin, but death. And, even he grieved for Lazarus, right? Like he wasn't like, don't, like stoic Jesus, like it's okay. We'll all be resurrected one day. Chin up, Martha. I mean, and he even knew, I mean, I presume he knew he was going to raise Lazarus, but he's still grieving. Like, it's just really incredible to see to see how Christ, the conqueror of death, nonetheless, in his time on earth, is also like, that's the only time he weeps, right? Is when a dear friend of his dies. And so he feels it in his being, right? The wrongness of death.
Yeah, so we're quickly turning this from the cultural podcast into the theological podcast.
Which is
really fun for me.
You can't, you can't just separate
sort of diving deep here. I mean, this question of sort of natural death versus unnatural death. And I mean, it's one that the tradition has wrestled with for a very long time. And it's, the biblical, the way the Bible talks about it is mixed, and there are all sorts of scripture verses in the Old Testament that seem to talk about death fairly unproblematically.
Right. Like, Sheol.
Yeah. So-and-so went down to their fathers and,
right.
and Sheol's kind of this interesting thing that, it's kind of a realm of the dead, but the undead, and, exactly what Sheol is and what it signifies. One of the things about Sheol that makes it so terrible is that you're cut off from the land of the living. And there are all these rhetorical questions about Sheol in the Old Testament about, do the dead praise you, God? And when we read this from a sort of a Christian New Testament perspective, our sort of immediate impulse is like, yes, like,
right.
But the answer, probably the implied answer in those scriptures was no. Like, God, you need to save us from death because the dead don't praise you and we want to praise you, right? And we want to stay part of this sort of worshiping community. And then over time, people might argue about this, but my sense of it is that over time in the Old Testament, there developed a broader sense that God was going to do something to restore the dead into fellowship with him, because he had these sort of promises of covenantal fidelity. And so God has to be true to his promises, but he doesn't seem to be. So how's he going to do that? And that's the context into which Jesus is born. But there is this sort of mixture of sort of like, well, in one sense, we're creatures,
right? And
creatures die, and we're firmly on the creature side of the creator-creature distinction, and only God is sort of immortal and infinite and those sorts of things. And so, we've talked in my theology class this year about death a little bit, and fun questions about what would have happened with Adam and Eve had they not sinned, and what were they sort of by nature immortal? The early church was pretty across the board in union on, they were not by nature immortal. They were sort of upheld by maybe a sort of special extra grace or donum super additum or something like that. That God was upholding them above their natural state, and then they returned to their natural state when they fell into sin and ruptured their relationship with God. And so the question of whether death is natural is even sort of a really complicated one from the beginning. I think, for me, it's really meaningful to me that we are sort of creatures who are by nature mortal.
Yeah.
And that we hope for immortality, not in ourselves, and not even in the like immortality of our souls, our sort of natural immortality, but in the fact that God relates to us and loves us and will continue to love us beyond the end. And so, so that a death can become for a Christian something more than the end of all relationships. I think that's what the evil of death is in Scripture, is the threat of relationlessness.
Yeah.
It's the threat of being cut off from the land of the living, from the worshiping community, from Yahweh, from God. And yet that's what we see in Scripture is not what happens when we die. That death is our limit, but death itself is limited by God. And on the far side of death, God is faithful. And so we hope for more. We hope that God will bring all things together and resurrect each of us into fellowship with him. C.S. Lewis has this great quote. He says it a bunch of different times. Nothing that hasn't died will be resurrected. And that's actually kind of one of the quotes that got me started on my dissertation research. Is like, what does he mean by that? And what, like, could that not just be like a spiritualism, but also maybe true in some deep sense that creatures, in a sense, need to die in order for God to raise them up to some glorified state, that we need to have a limit and we need to be faithful to the limit, this sort of spirituality of martyrdom, in order for God to show himself faithful and give us even more on the far side of it. And so, there are theologians who would say that even Adam and Eve, had they not sinned, would have reached a point where they would have switched from being able to die to being unable to die. That they would have been glorified at some point. And when that would be, none of us know. It's all speculation, whatever. But, what would it mean for them to reach an end of their mortal state and be sort of transferred into an immortal state? Basically, what it would be is a death without death. It would be a sort of an end of they would reach their limit, and yet that wouldn't mean separation from God. It would mean being brought into a fuller relationship with God. I don't know that that's true or even worth thinking about. It's all very speculative, but to me, it seems like maybe there's a sort of naturalness of having a limit or an end.
Yeah.
That even so, God can bring us through it. And so maybe as Christians who believe that the sting of death is gone, even though we still experience death, we can sort of meet the end in that spirit.
Yeah. I don't know. I feel like that's a good note to end on. There's something just hopeful about that, right? Like there's a way in which we feel the sting of death, but also that limit is not the end, right? That limit has its own limit, which is God.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for talking to me about death.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's been a pleasure, and in my experience, if you write a dissertation on death and dying, it means you have to talk about it. And when somebody asks you what you write your dissertation on, maybe I don't know if it's like this with you, but if you say you wrote on death, people will either shut down conversation completely right away, or they'll want to talk to you for an hour at a time. And,
I can see that.
And so just the opportunity to be able to sort of unpack some of these ideas and, just dwell with you in it. It's been really great.
This has been a production of George Fox Digital. If you like what you're hearing, subscribe to the George Fox Talks podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts on your phone or computer. You can check us out on the web at georgefox.edu/talks, where we have videos, publications, and more. And you can also find our playlist on YouTube at youtube.com/GeorgeFoxTalks.